The darkness swallowed her whole. 200 feet of empty air rushed past Evelyn Hartley's body as she plummeted through the Syrian night. The wind screamed in her ears, drowning out everything except the thunder of her own heartbeat. Above her, growing smaller with each passing millisecond, she could see the silhouettes of the men who had thrown her, her teammates, her brothers in arms. They were laughing. The stars wheeled overhead in a slow spiral, indifferent to the woman falling toward her death. Eve had exactly 3 seconds to live. 3 seconds to understand that everything she believed about loyalty, about honor, about the sacred bond between warriors had been a lie. In those 3 seconds, her entire life compressed into a single crystalline moment of clarity. She thought of her father, Master Chief Thomas Hartley, call sign Phantom, the greatest SEAL operator who never officially existed. The man who taught her to shoot before she learned to ride a bicycle. The man who promised he would always come home. He broke that promise 5 years ago, and now she understood why. The rocks rushed up to meet her. Eve closed her eyes and whispered into the void, "SEALs don't die." 48 hours earlier, the C-130 Hercules banked hard over the Syrian desert, its engines groaning against the weight of cargo and personnel. Lieutenant Evelyn Hartley sat strapped into the red nylon webbing that passed for seating in military transport aircraft, her eyes fixed on the horizon through a small porthole window. Below, the landscape stretched out in endless waves of brown and gold. Sand dunes rolled like frozen ocean swells, broken only by the occasional outcropping of dark volcanic rock. Somewhere down there, hidden among the wadis and ridgelines, was Forward Operating Base Sentinel, home of SEAL Team 7's Shadow Unit. Eve checked her watch. 14:32 local time. They would be on the ground in 20 minutes. She had waited 5 years for this moment. The official paperwork said Lieutenant Evelyn Hartley was being assigned to Shadow Unit as an intelligence analyst. Her orders came directly from Naval Special Warfare Command, citing her expertise in signal intelligence and pattern analysis. On paper, she was there to help the team identify high-value targets within a growing network of weapons traffickers operating along the Syrian-Iraqi border. That was the official story. The truth was something else entirely. Eve reached into her breast pocket and pulled out a worn photograph, its edges soft from years of handling. The image showed a younger version of herself, maybe 12 years old, standing next to a tall man in desert camouflage. They were both holding rifles, grinning at the camera with identical expressions of fierce joy. Her father had taken her shooting for the first time that day. Out in the California desert, far from prying eyes, he had placed a Remington 700 in her hands and taught her how to breathe, how to find the stillness between heartbeats, how to squeeze the trigger without disturbing the sight picture. Shooting isn't about killing, he had told her. It's about precision, discipline, control. A good marksman can put a bullet exactly where it needs to go, no more, no less. She had asked him why that mattered. Because someday you might have to protect someone you love, and when that moment comes, you can't afford to miss. Thomas Hartley had been a ghost even before he earned that call sign. 30 years of service to his country, most of it in operations that would never appear in any official record. He had fought in places that didn't exist, against enemies that were never named for reasons that remained classified long after the bullets stopped flying. And then 5 years ago, he had died. That was the official story, too. Helicopter crash in the mountains of Afghanistan. Mechanical failure during a routine extraction. No survivors, no bodies recovered. Just a folded flag and a letter of condolence signed by the Secretary of the Navy. Eve had never believed it. Her father was too careful, too experienced, too damn good to die in a routine extraction. He had survived 30 years of combat operations, countless missions behind enemy lines, situations that would have killed lesser men a dozen times over. The idea that he had simply fallen out of the sky due to mechanical failure was absurd, but she had no proof, only questions, only suspicions, only the nagging certainty that someone was lying to her about how her father really died. So she had spent 5 years preparing. 5 years climbing the ranks of naval intelligence, cultivating contacts, collecting fragments of information. 5 years waiting for the right opportunity to get close to the truth. That opportunity had finally arrived 3 months ago, when she intercepted a classified communication that made her blood run cold. Shadow Unit, Syria, Commander Roland Vance, her father's last commanding officer, the man who had signed off on the mission that killed him. Eve tucked the photograph back into her pocket as the C-130 began its descent. The aircraft shuddered and groaned, fighting against the thermal currents rising from the superheated desert floor. Through the porthole, she could see the angular shapes of blast barriers and guard towers resolving out of the brown haze. Phobie Sentinel, the end of her search, or maybe just the beginning. The heat hit her like a physical blow the moment she stepped off the aircraft. 112 degrees of dry, merciless Syrian summer, carrying with it the smell of diesel fuel, burning garbage, and the ever-present dust that worked its way into everything. Eve shouldered her pack and made her way across the tarmac toward the cluster of prefabricated buildings that formed the heart of the base. HESCO barriers lined the perimeter, 12-foot walls of wire mesh and sand that could stop anything short of a direct hit from a cruise missile. Guard towers rose at regular intervals, manned by soldiers who tracked her progress with the casual alertness of men accustomed to living in a combat zone. She had barely cleared the flight line when a voice called out behind her, "Lieutenant Hartley!" Eve turned to find a young enlisted man jogging toward her, his uniform already dark with sweat. He snapped a quick salute as he approached. "Ma'am, I'm Petty Officer Collins. Commander Vance sent me to escort you to the Tactical Operations Center." Eve returned the salute. "Lead the way." They walked in silence through the maze of shipping containers and temporary structures that made up the base. Eve cataloged everything she saw with the practiced eye of an intelligence officer. Vehicle positions, communication arrays, the subtle patterns of movement that revealed the rhythm of daily operations. Shadow Unit operated out of a hardened bunker near the center of the compound. The building was unremarkable from the outside, just another concrete box with reinforced walls and blast-resistant doors. But Eve knew that inside those walls, some of the most dangerous men in the United States military planned and executed operations that would never appear in any history book. Collins led her through a series of security checkpoints, each one requiring a different combination of biometric scans and access codes. Finally, they reached a heavy steel door marked with a simple placard, "Shadow Unit. Authorized personnel only." "Commander Vance is waiting for you inside, ma'am." Eve nodded her thanks and pushed through the door. The Tactical Operations Center was a hive of controlled chaos. Banks of computer monitors lined the walls, displaying satellite imagery, communication intercepts, and real-time intelligence feeds from a dozen different sources. A massive map table dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with markers and overlays representing the current disposition of friendly and enemy forces throughout the region. A dozen men worked at various stations throughout the room, their faces bathed in the blue glow of their screens. They glanced up as Eve entered, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. She was used to that look. Women in special operations were still rare enough to be remarkable, and many of the old guard still harbored reservations about their presence. Eve had learned long ago to ignore the skepticism and let her work speak for itself. "Lieutenant Hartley, The voice came from the far end of the room where a man in his early 50s stood studying a bank of monitors. He turned as Eve approached, and she got her first good look at Commander Roland Vance. He was not what she expected. Where she had imagined a villain, she found instead a tired, weathered warrior who looked like he had seen too much and slept too little. His gray hair was cropped close to his skull in the standard military cut, and deep lines bracketed his mouth and eyes. He moved with the careful economy of a man whose body had been broken and rebuilt more times than he cared to count. His handshake was firm but not aggressive. His smile seemed genuine, even warm. "Welcome to Shadow Unit," he said. "I've heard good things about your work in Bahrain. Admiral Whitmore speaks very highly of you." Eve kept her expression neutral. "Thank you, sir. I'm looking forward to contributing to the mission." "Straight to business, I like that." Vance gestured toward the map table. "Walk with me. I'll bring you up to speed on what we're dealing with out here." They crossed the room together past the rows of workstations and the men who operated them. Eve felt their eyes on her back, weighing and measuring. "For the past 6 months," Vance began, "we've been tracking a network of weapons traffickers operating along the Syrian-Iraqi border. They're moving everything from small arms to anti-aircraft missiles, selling to anyone with cash. ISIS remnants, Iranian proxies, local militias. Doesn't matter to them as long as the money's good." He tapped a point on the map, highlighting a remote valley deep in the mountainous terrain. 3 weeks ago, we intercepted communications suggesting they're planning something big, a major transaction that could shift the balance of power in the entire region. Your job is to help us figure out exactly what they're planning, who's involved, and how we can shut them down. Eve studied the map, committing the terrain to memory. "Do we have any assets in place?" "A few. Local informants mostly, unreliable but useful for corroborating other intelligence." Vance's expression darkened slightly. "This is a complicated operating environment, Lieutenant. Multiple factions, shifting alliances, everyone with their own agenda. Trust is a luxury we can't afford out here." The words hung in the air between them, and Eve wondered if they were meant as advice or warning. "I understand, sir." "Good." Vance's smile returned, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Let me introduce you to the rest of the team." The members of Shadow Unit were gathered in the briefing room adjacent to the TOC. 8 men ranging in age from late 20s to late 40s, all of them carrying the unmistakable aura of operators who had spent years at the sharp end of the spear. Eve recognized the type. Her father had been one of them, men who had trained their bodies and minds to function in conditions that would break ordinary soldiers. Men who had looked death in the face so many times that they had learned to greet it like an old acquaintance. They regarded her with varying degrees of interest as she entered the room with Commander Vance. "Gentlemen," Vance said, "this is Lieutenant Evelyn Hartley. She'll be attached to our unit for the duration of Operation Sandstorm. I expect you to extend her every professional courtesy." A large man in the front row shifted in his seat, his expression skeptical. He had the thick neck and heavy shoulders of a wrestler, and his arms were covered with tattoos that told the story of a long career in naval special warfare. "Intelligence analyst." The man's voice was a low rumble like distant thunder. "With respect, Commander, we need operators, not someone who's going to be reading reports in an air-conditioned office." "Senior Chief Loomis." Vance's tone carried a subtle edge of warning. "Lieutenant Hartley's assignment comes directly from SOCOM. If you have concerns about the composition of this team, I suggest you take them up with Admiral Morrison." Loomis held Vance's gaze for a long moment, then shrugged and looked away. "Just saying what everyone's thinking, sir." Eve stepped forward before Vance could respond. She had dealt with men like Loomis her entire career. The only way to earn their respect was to meet their challenge head-on. "Senior Chief, I understand your concerns. You don't know me, and you have no reason to trust my abilities. All I can tell you is that I'm here to do a job and I intend to do it well. Everything else is just noise." Loomis turned his attention to her, his eyes narrowing as he assessed this woman who dared to speak to him as an equal. Something flickered in his expression too quick to identify, but when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its hostile edge. "Fair enough, Lieutenant. Guess we'll see what you're made of." A younger man in the back row broke the tension with a friendly wave. He had an open, honest face and the kind of easy confidence that came from natural ability rather than arrogance. "Staff Sergeant Dean Calloway," he said. "Welcome to the team, ma'am. Don't mind Loomis. He's suspicious of everyone. It's what keeps him alive." Eve nodded her thanks, filing away the names and faces for future reference. Dean Calloway, a potential ally. Garrett Loomis, a potential problem. And Commander Roland Vance, the biggest unknown of all. The sun had set 3 hours ago, but the desert still radiated heat like a dying furnace. Eve sat alone in her quarters, a converted shipping container, barely large enough to hold a cot, a footlocker, and a small desk. The walls were thin enough that she could hear the generators humming in the distance, providing power to the base's essential systems. She had spent the afternoon familiarizing herself with the unit's operational files, studying the intelligence they had gathered on the weapons trafficking network. The information was extensive but incomplete, full of gaps and inconsistencies that suggested either poor analysis or deliberate obfuscation. Eve suspected the latter. She pulled out her personal laptop, a specially modified machine with encrypted storage and a secure satellite uplink. The device was technically against regulations, but she had learned long ago that regulations were made for people who couldn't be trusted to think for themselves. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, navigating through layers of security until she reached the files she had been compiling for the past 5 years. Fragments of communication intercepts, financial records that didn't quite add up, personnel movements that seemed to follow patterns invisible to casual observation. And at the center of it all, like a spider sitting in the heart of its web, Commander Roland Vance. Vance had been her father's commanding officer on his final mission. He had signed the orders that sent Thomas Hartley into those Afghan mountains. He had written the after-action report that blamed the death on mechanical failure. But the more Eve dug, the more holes she found in the official narrative. The helicopter that supposedly crashed had been inspected just 2 days before the mission. It had passed every check with flying colors. The weather conditions that night had been nearly perfect. The pilot had over 3,000 hours of flight time and an impeccable safety record. And yet somehow everything had gone wrong. Eve had spoken to the maintenance crew. She had tracked down the other pilots who were flying that night. She had spent months piecing together a picture of what really happened in those mountains, and the more she learned, the less she believed the official story. Something had gone wrong on that mission, something that had nothing to do with mechanical failure. Her father had discovered something dangerous enough to get him killed. And Commander Roland Vance was at the center of it. Eve closed her laptop and lay back on her cot, staring at the ceiling. The metal groaned slightly as she shifted her weight, settling into the uncomfortable embrace of military-grade bedding. Tomorrow she would begin her real mission, finding the truth about her father's death, no matter what it cost. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of briefings, analysis sessions, and reconnaissance planning. Eve threw herself into the work, demonstrating a level of competence that gradually earned her grudging respect from even the most skeptical members of the team. She identified 3 previously unknown communication nodes used by the weapons network. She correlated satellite imagery with signal intercepts to pinpoint the location of a suspected weapons cache. She developed a targeting package that would allow the team to interdict a supply convoy with minimal risk of civilian casualties. All the while she watched Vance as he moved through the operations center, noted the calls he took in private, cataloged the encrypted communications that arrived at odd hours. Something was happening beneath the surface of this unit, something that the official mission briefings didn't quite explain, and then on her second night at Phobie Sentinel she found it. Eve had been working late alone in the intelligence section while the rest of the team slept. Her access codes gave her limited entry into the unit's classified database, but limited was not the same as none. With patience and skill, she began to probe the system's defenses, looking for weaknesses. She found one just after midnight, a subdirectory buried deep in the command files, protected by encryption that was slightly out of date. Eve recognized the security protocol. It was the same one her father had used on his personal files. She cracked it in less than an hour. What she found made her heart stop. Financial records, dozens of them, wire transfers from accounts in Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, Dubai, hundreds of thousands of dollars flowing in and out of shell companies that existed only on paper. And at the end of the money trail, Commander Roland Vance. Eve stared at the screen, her mind racing through the implications. Vance was dirty. He was taking money from someone, large amounts of money that could not possibly be explained by his military salary. But who was paying him and for what? She dug deeper, following the digital breadcrumbs through a maze of financial transactions. The picture that emerged was worse than anything she had imagined. Vance wasn't just taking bribes, he was selling information. Classified information about SEAL operations, troop movements, the locations of American personnel throughout the region. And the buyers were the same networks that Shadow Unit was supposedly hunting. Eve felt sick. All those missions that had gone wrong. All those operators who had walked into ambushes that seemed to come from nowhere. The enemy had always known. They had always been one step ahead, because someone on the inside was telling them exactly where to look. She thought of her father. Thomas Hartley had been one of the best intelligence officers in naval special warfare. If anyone could have uncovered a conspiracy like this, it would have been him. Had he found out? Had he discovered what Vance was doing? Is that why he died? Eve saved the files to her encrypted drive, her hands trembling slightly as she worked. This was it. This was the evidence she needed to bring Vance down, to expose the rot at the heart of Shadow Unit. But she needed more. She needed to catch him in the act, to document a transaction that could not be explained away or classified into oblivion. Tomorrow night, the team was scheduled for a reconnaissance mission. A routine observation of a suspected weapons cache in the mountains east of the base. Eve would be going with them, and she would be watching. The convoy rolled out of Phobie Sentinel at 0200 hours. 2 MRAP vehicles, their armor scarred by years of hard use, carrying 8 members of Shadow Unit, plus 1 intelligence officer. Eve sat in the rear vehicle, wedged between equipment cases and ammunition crates, her body armor feeling like a straitjacket in the cramped space. Dean Calloway sat across from her, his rifle cradled loosely across his chest. He caught her eye and offered a reassuring nod. "First time outside the wire?" Eve shook her head. "I've done convoy operations in Iraq, but nothing like this." "Syria's different," Calloway agreed. "Iraq, you knew who the enemy was. Here everyone's got an angle. Militias, tribal fighters, government forces, foreign advisors. Half the time you can't tell who's shooting at who. And the other half," Calloway's expression grew serious. "The other half, everyone's shooting at you." The vehicle lurched as it climbed a steep grade, leaving the paved road for a barely visible track that wound up into the mountains. Eve grabbed a handhold to steady herself, watching through the ballistic glass as the landscape transformed around them. The desert floor gave way to rocky highlands, ancient volcanic formations that jutted from the earth like the bones of some long-dead giant. In the silver light of a half-moon, the terrain looked alien, otherworldly. Commander Vance's voice crackled over the radio. All units, this is Shadow 6. We're approaching the observation point. Maintain noise discipline from here on out. The vehicles ground to a halt at the base of a steep escarpment. Eve dismounted with the rest of the team, feeling the cold mountain air bite through her uniform. At this altitude, the desert heat was a distant memory. They moved in single file up a narrow trail, their night vision equipment painting the world in shades of green and gray. Loomis took point, his movements surprisingly graceful for a man of his size. Vance followed close behind, then the rest of the team in order of seniority. Eve was near the rear with only Calloway behind her. The trail ended at a rocky outcropping that overlooked a deep valley. Below, perhaps 1,000 meters distant, Eve could see the angular shapes of buildings clustered around a central courtyard. Vehicles were parked in neat rows. Figures moved between structures, their forms ghostly in the enhanced vision of her night optics. But something was wrong. Eve studied the scene below, comparing it to the intelligence briefings she had memorized. The weapons cache was supposed to be a small operation, maybe a dozen fighters guarding a handful of shipping containers. What she was looking at was something much larger, and there, walking across the courtyard toward a group of armed men, was a figure she recognized. Commander Roland Vance. Eve's blood ran cold. Vance was supposed to be on the ridge with the rest of the team. She had seen him take position just minutes ago, but there he was 1,000 meters below, greeting the same men they were supposedly here to observe. She fumbled for her FLIR camera, hands shaking as she raised it to her eye. The thermal imaging device cut through the darkness, revealing details invisible to the naked eye. Vance was accepting something from one of the fighters, a briefcase. He opened it, nodded with apparent satisfaction, then produced a tablet computer from his vest and began showing something to the men around him. Maps. He was showing them maps, the locations of American bases, the positions of SEAL teams throughout the region. Everything they needed to know to kill her countrymen. Eve captured everything. The handoff, the documents, the faces of the men involved. Her camera recorded it all in damning detail. "Lieutenant," the voice came from directly behind her. Eve spun around, her hand dropping to her sidearm. Loomis stood there, his massive frame blocking the trail. Behind him, 2 more members of the team. Their rifles were raised. "Senior Chief," Eve kept her voice steady. "There's been a security breach. Vance is down in the valley. He's selling—" "I know exactly what he's selling." Loomis's face was expressionless. "The question is, what do we do about you?" Eve's mind raced through her options. 3 armed men, all of them experienced operators. Her sidearm was still holstered. Even if she could draw before they fired, she couldn't take all of them. "This doesn't have to end badly," she said. "You can still do the right thing. Help me expose what's happening here." Loomis actually laughed. "The right thing, Lieutenant. Do you have any idea how much money Vance is paying us? More than the Navy gave us in 20 years of service. And all we have to do is look the other way. People are dying. American soldiers. People die in wars. That's how it works." Loomis's expression hardened. "What matters is who profits from it." Movement on the trail behind Loomis. More figures emerging from the shadows. Eve counted quickly. 6 men, plus Loomis and his 2 companions. The entire team except Calloway. And then Vance himself appeared, climbing up from the valley below. He was carrying the briefcase, his face sheened with sweat from the exertion. He stopped when he saw Eve surrounded by his men. Something flickered in his eyes. Regret, perhaps. Or maybe just annoyance at an inconvenient complication. "Lieutenant Hartley," he spoke her name like a sentence. "I was wondering when you would make your move. You're very much your father's daughter." Eve felt the words like a physical blow. "You knew." "Of course I knew. The moment I saw your assignment orders, I knew exactly why you were here. Vance set the briefcase down and approached her. His movements careful, deliberate. Your father was a problem. He discovered things he wasn't supposed to discover, asked questions he wasn't supposed to ask. He found out you were a traitor. He found out I was a businessman. Vance stopped a few feet away, close enough for Eve to see the cold calculation in his eyes. The Navy used me for 30 years. Sent me to fight their wars, bleed for their causes, sacrifice everything for a country that couldn't be bothered to take care of its own. And when it was over, what did I get? A pension that wouldn't cover medical bills and a thank you card signed by some bureaucrat who never heard a shot fired in anger. So you sold out your brothers, you got them killed. I got paid what I was worth. Vance's voice hardened. Your father could have done the same. I offered him a partnership. Told him there was enough money for everyone, but he was too righteous, too noble. His lip curled. Too stupid to know when he was beat. Eve's hand twitched toward her weapon. Loomis caught the movement and raised his rifle, the barrel aimed directly at her chest. Don't, Vance warned. You're good, Lieutenant, maybe even as good as your father, but you're not that good. What happened to him? Eve's voice was barely a whisper. What really happened? Vance stared at her for a long moment. Then he shrugged as if the answer hardly mattered. I shot him. In the back of the head while he was calling for extraction. Then I put his body in the helicopter and had my people crash it into the mountainside. He smiled a thin, cruel expression. Clean, professional, just like he taught me. The world went red. Eve lunged for Vance, her training forgotten. Her discipline dissolved by a wave of pure primal rage. She wanted to tear him apart with her bare hands to make him suffer the way her father had suffered. She never got close. Loomis hit her from the side, driving her to the ground with his full weight. She fought like a wild animal, breaking his grip twice before the others piled on. Fists and boots rained down on her. She felt ribs crack, tasted blood, saw stars exploding across her vision. When they finally dragged her to her feet, Eve could barely stand. Blood streamed from a gash above her eye. Her left arm hung at an odd angle, possibly broken. Vance studied her with clinical detachment. I'm going to miss you, Lieutenant. You would have been a hell of an operator. He nodded to his men. Take her to the cliff. They dragged her to the edge of the outcropping. 200 feet of empty air yawned below, ending in a jumble of broken rocks that gleamed white in the moonlight. Eve looked at the men holding her. Loomis. 2 others whose names she had never learned. They wouldn't meet her eyes. She looked at Vance. He was already turning away, reaching for his radio to begin fabricating whatever story would explain her death. Eve gathered what remained of her strength. Vance! He paused, glancing back over his shoulder. Seals don't die. Vance smiled. Tonight one does. They threw her into the darkness. The wind screamed past her face as she fell. The rocks rushed up to meet her. The stars wheeled overhead in their slow, eternal dance. And somewhere in the space between one heartbeat and the next, Evelyn Hartley closed her eyes and thought of her father. The impact came like a thunderclap. And then there was nothing. Nothing but darkness and silence, and the fading echo of her promise. The first thing she felt was pain. It radiated through every fiber of her being, a symphony of agony that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. Her ribs screamed with each shallow breath. Her left leg throbbed with a deep grinding ache that spoke of broken bones. Her skull felt like it had been split open and reassembled by someone who had never seen a human head before. But she felt it, which meant she was alive. Evelyn Hartley opened her eyes to darkness, not the darkness of death, but the darkness of an enclosed space. Stone walls curved overhead, barely visible in the faint orange glow of a dying fire. The air smelled of smoke, herbs, and something else. Something medicinal. She tried to move and immediately regretted it. Pain exploded through her body so intense that her vision went white. A sound escaped her lips, something between a gasp and a scream. A shadow moved at the edge of her vision. Easy. The voice was male, deep and gravelly, with the cadence of someone who had spent decades giving orders. You've got 3 broken ribs, a fractured tibia, and enough contusions to make a boxer jealous. Moving around isn't going to help any of that. Eve turned her head, the motion sending fresh waves of pain through her neck and shoulders. A man sat beside the fire, his face half illuminated by the flickering flames. He was old, perhaps late 60s, with iron-gray hair cropped close to his skull and a face that looked like it had been carved from weathered granite. His shoulders were still broad despite his age, and he held himself with the unconscious alertness of a career soldier. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, pale blue, almost colorless, with the flat, assessing gaze of a predator, evaluating potential prey. She knew those eyes. She had seen them in photographs, in classified after-action reports, in the stories her father told late at night when the bourbon had loosened his tongue and the memories came flooding back. Colonel Brennan. Her voice came out as a croak barely recognizable. Marcus Brennan. The old man's expression didn't change. Most people call me Ironside. You're dead. Eve's mind struggled to process what she was seeing. You died 3 years ago. Afghanistan, ambush in the Korangal Valley. That's what the reports say. Ironside rose from his position by the fire, moving with the careful economy of a man whose body had been broken and rebuilt more times than he cared to count. Reports lie. He crossed to where she lay and knelt beside her, producing a canteen from somewhere within his worn jacket. The water was warm and tasted faintly of minerals. But Eve drank greedily, suddenly aware of how desperately thirsty she was. Where am I? She asked when she had finished. Cave system about 6 miles from where you fell. Local Kurds use it for shelter during the winter months. Ironside recapped the canteen. You're lucky to be alive, Lieutenant. That fall should have killed you. How did I survive? You didn't fall all the way down. There's a shelf about 50 feet below the cliff edge covered with thorn bush. You hit that first, then rolled another 20 feet onto a rocky ledge. Ironside's expression remained impassive. The thorns tore you up pretty good, but they slowed your descent, kept you from hitting the bottom at terminal velocity. Eve closed her eyes, trying to remember. The fall, the wind, the rocks rushing up to meet her. And then nothing. Nothing until she woke up here. You found me. I've been watching Shadow Unit for 3 years, waiting for someone to get close enough to Vance to matter. Ironside settled back on his haunches, studying her with those cold, evaluating eyes. When I saw them throw you off that cliff, I figured you were either very important or very unlucky, probably both. You knew about Vance. I knew about Vance before most people knew his name. Something dark flickered across Ironside's face. He killed my team. 6 men, all of them better soldiers than he'll ever be. Sold their positions to the Taliban for $50,000 a head. Eve felt her chest tighten. The ambush in Korangal. There was no ambush. Vance arranged for us to walk into a kill zone. Made sure the enemy knew exactly where we'd be and when we'd be there. Ironside's voice was flat, emotionless, but Eve could hear the rage burning beneath the surface. I was the only survivor. Took 2 rounds in the back and spent 6 weeks in a cave. Just like this one, being nursed back to health by an old woman who didn't speak a word of English. Why didn't you report it? Why didn't you come forward? Because Vance has friends. People in Washington who profit from his business arrangements. People who would make sure any investigation died before it started. Ironside shook his head slowly. I tried once. Made contact with naval intelligence, told them everything I knew. 2 weeks later, the officer I spoke to was killed in a car accident. Very convenient. very professional. Eve thought of her father, of the helicopter crash that had never made sense, of the questions that had haunted her for 5 years. Thomas Hartley. She spoke the name carefully, watching Ironside's reaction. You knew him. The change in Ironside's expression was subtle but unmistakable. A softening around the eyes, a slight relaxation of the hard line of his jaw. I knew him. Ooh. We served together in Desert Storm back in '91. I was 34 years old, he was 29. Young and stupid enough to think we were invincible. The ghost of a smile crossed Ironside's face. He saved my life twice. Once in Kuwait City when a building collapsed on our position, once in a bar fight in San Diego when 4 Marines decided they didn't like the way I looked at their girlfriends. Despite everything, Eve felt a faint smile tug at her lips. That sounds like him. Your father was the best operator I ever worked with, and the most stubborn son of a bitch I ever met. Ironside's eyes grew distant. When he believed in something, nothing could shake him loose. Not orders, not threats, not common sense. He found out about Vance. That's why he died. It wasn't a question. Ironside nodded slowly. Tom started digging about 6 years ago. He noticed patterns in the intelligence, missions that went wrong in ways that shouldn't have been possible, ambushes that hit exactly where they would hurt the most. He paused, his gaze distant. He traced it back to Vance, gathered enough evidence to put him away for 100 years. What happened? Vance found out. Someone in naval intelligence tipped him off. Ironside's hands clenched into fists. Tom was supposed to meet with investigators from NCIS. He never made it. His helicopter went down 2 hours before the meeting was scheduled to begin. Eve felt tears burning in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not now. Vance told me. Her voice was barely a whisper. Before they threw me off the cliff, he said he shot my father in the back of the head, said he watched him die. Ironside was silent for a long moment. The fire crackled between them, sending shadows dancing across the cave walls. When he spoke again, his voice was soft. Tom knew what was coming. He came to see me 3 days before he died, gave me something and made me promise to keep it safe. He reached into his jacket and produced a small object. He said if anything happened to him, I should wait until someone came looking for answers. Someone who wouldn't stop until they found the truth. He held out his hand. Resting in his palm was a USB drive, battered and worn, but still intact. He said you would come eventually. He knew his daughter better than anyone. Eve took the drive with trembling fingers. Such a small thing, such an ordinary object. But she knew with absolute certainty that it contained everything she had been searching for, the evidence that would destroy Roland Vance, the truth about her father's death. What's on it? Everything. Ironside leaned back against the cave wall. Financial records, communication intercepts, names, dates, account numbers, enough to bring down Vance and everyone who ever worked with him. Eve clutched the drive like a lifeline. Why didn't you use it? Why wait 3 years? Because evidence isn't enough, not against someone like Vance. He's got too many friends, too many ways to make problems disappear. Ironside's eyes hardened. We need to catch him in the act, document a transaction so clearly that no one can explain it away or classify it into oblivion. The weapons deal. Eve's mind raced back to what she had seen in the valley. That wasn't weapons he was selling, it was information. Worse than information. Ironside's expression grew grim. Vance has been building to this for years. Small deals, testing the waters, establishing trust with his buyers. But now he's planning something bigger, the deal that sets him up for life. What is he selling? Ironside was silent for a moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. Then, He sighed. The locations of 3 classified SEAL facilities, one in Syria, one in Iraq, one in Yemen. He met her eyes. Combined with detailed information about security protocols, personnel rotations, and communication frequencies. Everything a hostile force would need to launch coordinated attacks on all 3 sites simultaneously. Eve felt the blood drain from her face. That's hundreds of people. 247 according to current deployment figures. Ironside's voice was flat. Operators support staff intelligence personnel, all of them sitting in facilities that the enemy isn't supposed to know exist. In exchange for what? $50 million paid in raw heroin that Vance can convert to cash through his network of distributors. Ironside shook his head slowly. He's been planning this for years, building the infrastructure, cultivating the buyers, waiting for the perfect moment. When does it happen? The transaction is scheduled for 7 weeks from now. Point Alpha, a remote airstrip about 40 miles from here on the Iraqi border. Ironside allowed himself a thin smile. Your recovery timing should work out perfectly. Eve's grip tightened on the USB drive. 7 weeks. 7 weeks to heal. 7 weeks to prepare. 7 weeks to bring down the man who murdered her father. I need to contact someone, she said. Admiral Whitmore at the Pentagon. He was a friend of my father. He can be trusted. I know Charles Whitmore. We served together in Panama. Ironside nodded slowly. He's one of the few people in Washington who might actually do something with this information. Can you get me communications equipment? I can do better than that. Ironside rose to his feet. I've got a secure satellite uplink hidden about 3 miles from here, completely off the grid. Even the NSA doesn't know it exists. Eve tried to sit up and immediately collapsed back onto the thin mattress, gasping in pain. That's going to be a problem, she managed. Ironside looked down at her, and for the first time something approaching warmth entered his expression. You've got 6 weeks, Lieutenant. That's how long it takes to heal 3 broken ribs and a fractured tibia, assuming you don't do anything stupid. He crossed his arms. Plenty of time to get you back on your feet before the transaction goes down. 6 weeks of what? Recovery, training, preparation. Ironside's cold eyes gleamed in the firelight. Your father taught me everything I know about long-range shooting. It seems only fitting that I pass that knowledge on to his daughter. Eve stared at him. You're going to train me. I'm going to finish what your father started, and you're going to help me. Ironside turned toward the cave entrance. Get some rest, Lieutenant. Tomorrow we start putting you back together. He disappeared into the darkness, leaving Eve alone with the fire and the pain and the small piece of plastic that held the key to everything. She closed her fingers around the USB drive and held it against her chest. 6 weeks. 6 weeks to become strong enough to face the man who killed her father. 6 weeks to learn everything she needed to know about bringing down a traitor. She closed her eyes and let the exhaustion wash over her. For the first time in 5 years, she knew exactly what she had to do. The next 6 weeks tested Eve in ways she had never imagined possible. The first 2 weeks were the hardest. Her body had been broken in the fall, and broken bodies take time to heal. She spent most of those early days drifting in and out of consciousness. Her dreams haunted by images of her father and the sound of gunfire and the endless sensation of falling through darkness. Ironside proved to be an unexpectedly skilled caretaker. He changed her bandages with practiced efficiency, adjusted her splints when the swelling went down, and forced her to drink endless cups of bitter herbal tea that he claimed would speed her recovery. The tea tasted like boiled lawn clippings, but Eve drank it without complaint. During those long hours of forced inactivity, Ironside talked. He told her about Desert Storm, about the 100-hour ground war that had seemed so simple at the time, so clean compared to what came after. He told her about serving alongside her father in Kuwait City, clearing buildings room by room while oil fires turned the sky black and the scent ran red with blood. He told her about Thomas Hartley. "Your father was the best shot I ever saw," Ironside said one evening, feeding scraps of wood into the fire. "Not just technically. Lots of people can put rounds on target at 1,000 meters. Tom could do something more. He could wait. He had this patience, this stillness that let him lie in position for days if necessary, just waiting for the right moment." "He tried to teach me," Eve said. "When I was younger, we used to go out to the desert and shoot for hours." "I know. He talked about you constantly. Said you had natural talent, but you were too impatient, too eager to prove yourself." Ironside glanced at her. "Sound familiar?" Eve managed a weak smile despite the pain. "He said the same thing to me, right before I joined the Navy. He was proud of you, prouder than he probably ever let on." Ironside's expression softened slightly. "Tom wasn't good at showing emotion. It's a common problem with men like us. We spend so long learning to suppress everything that we forget how to let it out." "I know. I used to think he was disappointed in me, that I wasn't good enough, wasn't tough enough." Eve stared at the fire. "It wasn't until after he died that I realized he was trying to protect me, trying to keep me away from the life that eventually killed him. He knew the risks, we all did." Ironside shook his head slowly. "The difference is Tom believed in something. He believed in honor and duty and the oath we all swore when we put on the uniform. That's why he couldn't let Vance's betrayal stand. It went against everything he was. And it got him killed. It got him killed," Ironside agreed. "But it also led you here, to this cave, to me, to the chance to finish what he started." He met her eyes. "Your father planted a seed, Eve. He gathered the evidence, made the connections, laid the groundwork for everything that comes next. All we have to do is harvest what he grew." Eve thought about that for a long time. By the 3rd week, she could sit up without assistance. By the 4th, she was walking first with a crude crutch fashioned from a tree branch, then on her own. Her ribs still ached with every breath and her leg throbbed constantly, but the pain was manageable now. A companion rather than an enemy. Ironside began her training as soon as she could stand. They started with the basics: breathing exercises, meditation techniques, the fundamental skills of stillness and patience that form the foundation of long-range shooting. "A sniper's most important tool isn't his rifle," Ironside told her during one of their early sessions. "It's his mind. You can have the best equipment in the world, but if you can't control your thoughts, if you can't find that place of perfect calm, you'll never hit anything that matters." Eve struggled at first. Her mind kept returning to Vance, to her father, to the anger and grief that had driven her for 5 years. Every time she tried to find stillness, the memories came flooding back, disrupting her concentration, scattering her focus. Ironside was patient. "You're fighting yourself," he observed one afternoon, watching her miss target after target with the old Dragunov he had acquired from local contacts. "You think you can muscle through the emotions, force them into submission. But that's not how it works. Then how does it work? You don't suppress the anger. You use it." Ironside took the rifle from her hands and settled into position. "Watch." He was motionless for perhaps 30 seconds. Then, without any visible preparation, he squeezed the trigger. 500 meters away, a rock the size of a fist exploded into fragments. "The anger is fuel," he said, handing the rifle back. "It's energy. Raw, powerful, dangerous if mishandled. Your job isn't to eliminate it. Your job is to channel it, transform it from something chaotic into something precise." Eve tried again, and again. and again. Slowly, gradually, she began to understand. The anger didn't disappear, but it changed, became focused, directed. She learned to let it flow through her without controlling her, to use its energy while maintaining her discipline. By the 5th week, she could hit targets at 600 meters with consistent accuracy. By the 6th week, she was ready. Time to show you what I've been building for 3 years. Ironside led her through the cave system to a small chamber he had converted into a makeshift operations center. Maps covered the walls, photographs, surveillance images captured over 3 years of patient watching, and in the center of it all, a single laptop connected to a satellite antenna that protruded through a crack in the cave ceiling. He pulled up the surveillance data. Vance's entire operation laid out in detail. Communication patterns, financial transactions, personnel movements, everything we need to take him down. Eve studied the data with practiced eyes. Call times, duration, signal strength, the raw material of intelligence analysis. Who's his buyer? Ironside tapped a command and a new image appeared on screen. A man in traditional Arab dress, his face weathered by sun and wind, his eyes cold as chips of obsidian. Khalil al-Rashid, former Iraqi intelligence officer under Saddam. Now he runs one of the largest smuggling networks in the Middle East. He's the middleman. The real buyers are someone with much deeper pockets. Eve felt a chill run down her spine. Who? I don't know yet, but it doesn't matter for our purposes. Ironside pulled up another file. What matters is this. The transaction is scheduled for 1 week from now, 0300 hours at Point Alpha. He showed her the location. A remote airstrip carved out of the desert, accessible only by a single dirt road that wound through miles of empty terrain. The perfect place for a clandestine meeting. Vance will be there personally, Ironside continued. He always handles the big deals himself, doesn't trust anyone else with the details. How many men will he have? His entire team, 8 operators plus himself. Ironside's expression darkened. They're all compromised. Every one of them has been taking money from Vance for years. Eve thought of Dean Calloway, the young sergeant who had shown her kindness in a room full of hostility. Was he dirty too? Had his friendly manner been nothing but an act? She didn't want to believe it. What about outside support? She asked. I contacted Admiral Whitmore 2 days ago. Used the secure channel, transmitted everything we have on Vance. Ironside allowed himself a grim smile. He's sending a team, 6 operators from DevGru, the best of the best. They'll be in position at Point Alpha before the transaction begins. Then we have them. We have a chance. Ironside's smile faded. But Vance didn't survive this long by being careless. He'll have contingencies, escape routes, probably people inside the Pentagon who'll warn him if anything looks wrong. So what do we do? Ironside turned to face her fully. In the pale glow of the laptop screen, his weathered features looked carved from stone. We go in ourselves, you and me. DevGru handles the perimeter, catches anyone who tries to run, but we need someone on the inside, someone close enough to document the transaction and make sure Vance doesn't slip away before the net closes. Eve understood what he was asking. You want me to go back? I want you to finish what your father started. Ironside held her gaze. Tom gathered the evidence. He laid the groundwork, but he never got the chance to see it through. You can give him that. You can make sure his death meant something. Eve was silent for a long moment. She thought of her father, of the photograph she still carried in her pocket, of the promise she had made to herself 5 years ago, standing before an empty grille and a folded flag. Find the truth. She had found it. Now it was time to act on it. Tell me what I need to do. Ironside nodded slowly. First, we need an ally inside Shadow Unit. There's one person who might help us. Staff Sergeant Dean Calloway. He pulled up a personnel file. He's the only member of Vance's team who hasn't taken money. As far as I can tell, he's clean. Eve felt a surge of relief. I knew it. He was different from the others. Different doesn't mean trustworthy. He might be clean because he hasn't been offered the right price yet. Ironside's expression was skeptical. But he's our best option. If we can get him to cooperate, he can provide us access to the operation from the inside. How do we contact him? You contact him. Ironside handed her a small satellite communicator. Tomorrow night, Vance is sending a team out on patrol. Calloway will be with them. I've identified a window when he'll be separated from the others. You'll have maybe 5 minutes to make contact and convince him to help us. And if he refuses... Ironside's cold eyes were hard. Then we find another way. But we don't let him warn Vance. Whatever happens, the operation cannot be compromised. Eve understood what he was saying. If Calloway refused to help, if he showed any sign of alerting Vance to their presence, she would have to stop him, permanently. She nodded. I understand. Good. Ironside turned back to the laptop. Now let's go over the approach. You'll need to know the terrain, the patrol patterns, every possible variable that might affect the contact. They worked through the night, studying maps and satellite imagery, memorizing routes and fallback positions. By dawn, Eve knew the operational area as well as she knew her own apartment back in Virginia. When they finally stopped, Ironside placed a hand on her shoulder. Your father would be proud of you, he said quietly. Everything you've done, everything you're about to do, he would be proud. Eve felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them away. I know, she said. I know he would. The contact with Calloway went better than she had dared to hope. She found him at the designated coordinates, separated from the rest of the patrol by a rocky outcropping that blocked line of sight to his teammates. He spun when she emerged from the shadows, his rifle coming up automatically. Then he saw her face. Jesus Christ! The words came out as a whisper. His weapon lowered slowly as if his arms had forgotten how to hold it up. You're alive. I need your help, Dean. He stared at her for a long moment. She could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. The shock, the disbelief, the gradual understanding of what her survival meant. Vance. His voice hardened. He said you fell, said it was an accident. He threw me off a cliff because I found out he's a traitor. He's been selling classified information to our enemies for years. 11 SEALs are dead because of him. Eve stepped closer. Including my father. Calloway's expression shifted. She saw the pieces clicking into place. The ambushes, he said slowly. The missions that went wrong. I always thought something was off, but I could never... He trailed off, shaking his head. Son of a bitch. I have evidence. Everything we need to bring him down. But I need someone on the inside. Someone who can help me document the transaction and make sure Vance doesn't escape. What transaction? Eve told him. The $50 million, the locations of 3 SEAL facilities, the 247 lives hanging in the balance. By the time she finished, Calloway's face had gone pale. 1 week, he said, and then he sells out everyone I've ever served with. Unless we stop him. Calloway was silent for a long moment. Then he looked up and Eve saw something new in his eyes. Something hard and cold and absolutely determined. Tell me what you need me to do. They planned through the remaining darkness. Calloway would maintain his cover, pretending everything was normal while feeding information to Eve about Vance's movements and preparations. When the transaction went down, he would be in position to provide support from the inside. There's something you should know, Calloway said as they prepared to separate. Vance has been acting strange the last few days, jumpy, paranoid, like he's expecting something to go wrong. Has he said anything specific? Not directly, but I overheard him talking to Loomis yesterday. Something about a backup plan, an insurance policy in case things go sideways. Eve filed the information away. Keep your eyes open. Anything you learn, anything at all, you let me know. Calloway nodded. He started to turn away, then paused. Your father, he said quietly. I heard stories about him when I was going through buds. They said he was one of the best operators who ever lived. Said he could shoot the wings off a fly at 1,000 meters. The stories are true. I believe it. Calloway met her eyes. You've got his eyes, you know. Same look, like you can see right through a person. Eve didn't know what to say to that. Calloway smiled slightly. Give Vance hell, Lieutenant. For all of us. Then he was gone, disappearing into the darkness to rejoin his patrol. Eve watched him go. 1 week. 1 week until everything changed. She turned and began the long walk back to the cave where Ironside was waiting with the satellite communicator and a secure line to Admiral Whitmore. It was time to finish what her father started. The desert held its breath. 7 days had passed since Eve's contact with Calloway. 7 days of preparation, planning, and waiting. 7 days of watching the clock tick down toward the moment that would define everything. Now, finally, that moment had arrived. Eve lay prone on a rocky ridge 800 meters from Point Alpha. Her body pressed flat against the cold stone. The SVD Dragunov rested in her hands, its familiar weight a comfort against the tension coiling in her chest. Through the PSO-1 scope, she could see the airstrip laid out below like a map drawn in moonlight and shadow. The facility was exactly as Ironside had described. A single runway carved from the desert floor long enough to accommodate small cargo aircraft. A cluster of prefabricated buildings huddled at the southern end. Vehicle tracks crisscrossing the hard-packed earth like the lines on an old man's face. And people. Lots of people. Eve counted 8 figures moving around the perimeter. Shadow Unit. Vance's men. Traitors, every one of them bought and paid for with blood money. She adjusted her scope, scanning methodically from left to right. There, near the largest building, Commander Roland Vance stood with his arms crossed, watching his men establish security positions. Even at this distance, Eve could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his head kept turning to check the darkness beyond the lights. He was nervous. Good. Shadow 1, this is Overwatch. I have eyes on the target. Eve spoke softly into the satellite communicator clipped to her vest. 8 hostiles visible. Primary target is at the main structure. No sign of the buyers yet. Ironside's voice crackled back through her earpiece. Copy, Overwatch. Viper team is in position at the eastern approach. They'll move on your signal. Viper team. 6 operators from DevGru, hand-picked by Admiral Whitmore and inserted by helicopter 12 hours ago. They were positioned in a wide arc around Point Alpha, ready to close the net the moment the transaction began. What's Calloway's status? He checked in 20 minutes ago. He's with the security detail on the north side. Says Vance has been acting paranoid all day, checking weapons, reviewing contingency plans. A pause. He thinks Vance suspects something. Eve felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night. Does he know about us specifically? Unknown. But we proceed as planned. If Vance runs before the transaction, we lose everything. Eve understood. They needed to catch Vance in the act, needed to document the exchange with evidence so damning that no amount of political influence could make it disappear. Without that, all their preparation would be worthless. I'll maintain Overwatch. Let me know when the buyers arrive. Copy. Ironside out. Eve settled deeper into her position, letting her breathing slow, her heartbeat steady. The scope became an extension of her eye, the rifle an extension of her will. She watched. She waited. 45 minutes later, the buyers arrived. They came from the east, a convoy of 3 vehicles bouncing along the dirt road with their headlights off. Eve tracked their approach through her scope, counting heads as the trucks rolled to a stop at the edge of the airstrip. 15 men climbed out. Most were armed with AK-47s, their faces wrapped in scarves despite the cool night air. But one man stood apart from the others. He wore traditional Arab dress, his posture radiating authority. His movements deliberate and controlled. Khalil al-Rashid, the middleman. Eve watched as Vance walked out to meet him. The 2 men shook hands, their conversation inaudible at this distance. But their body language spoke volumes. This was not their first meeting. They knew each other, trusted each other as much as men in their business could trust anyone. Shadow 1 buyers have arrived. 15 hostiles. Positive ID on al-Rashid. Eve kept her voice calm despite the adrenaline surging through her system. Primary target is approaching the main structure with the buyer. Copy Overwatch. Viper team is standing by. Wait for confirmation of the exchange before giving the signal. Eve watched through her scope as Vance and al-Rashid entered the largest building, followed by a handful of men from each side. The rest remained outside, eyeing each other with the wary alertness of predators forced to share the same territory. Minutes passed. 5, 10, 15. Then Vance emerged carrying a metal briefcase. He walked to where al-Rashid's men had gathered around the lead vehicle. One of them produced a large duffel bag and set it on the hood. Al-Rashid nodded, and the bag was unzipped to reveal tightly wrapped packages of brown substance. Heroin, $50 million worth. Vance examined the contents briefly, then handed over the briefcase. Al-Rashid opened it, and even at 800 meters, Eve could see the glow of a tablet screen illuminating his face. The locations, the security protocols, everything needed to kill 247 American service members. Shadow 1 exchange confirmed. I repeat, exchange confirmed, ready to give the signal. Copy Overwatch. Viper team is moving to phase line Alpha. Give the signal on my mark. Eve's finger found the trigger of the Dragunov. Her breathing slowed. Her heartbeat steadied. The world narrowed to the small circle of her scope and the man standing at its center. Roland Vance, traitor, murderer, the man who killed her father. 3, 2, 1, mark. Eve fired. The shot was perfect. 800 meters wind from the left at 4 miles per hour elevation adjusted for the slight downward angle. The bullet crossed the distance in just over a second. But she wasn't aiming at Vance. Not yet. Senior Chief Garrett Loomis stood 3 feet to his commander's left, his rifle held loosely across his chest. He was scanning the darkness, alert for threats he couldn't see. He never saw the one that killed him. The round took him in the center of the chest, punching through his body armor and dropping him like a marionette with its strings cut. He was dead before he hit the ground. Everything happened at once. Vance dove for cover, dragging al-Rashid with him. His men scattered, taking up defensive positions behind vehicles and buildings. The buyers did the same, their weapons coming up as they searched for the source of the shot. Eve worked the bolt of the Dragunov, chambering another round. Found her next target. Fired. Another traitor fell. And another. At the perimeter, Viper team exploded into action. 6 shadows emerged from the darkness, their suppressed weapons spitting death with mechanical precision. They hit the enemy positions from 3 directions, simultaneously overwhelming the defenders with speed and violence of action. Eve kept firing. 4 shots, 4 kills. The Dragunov was empty. She reached for a fresh magazine, and then everything went wrong. A burst of automatic fire erupted from inside the Viper formation. Eve watched in horror as 2 of the DevGru operators went down, shot in the back by one of their own. Lieutenant Commander Preston. She recognized him through her scope. One of the 6 operators Admiral Whitmore had sent to help them. A traitor. Preston was moving toward the main building, firing at anyone who got in his way. He was shouting something into his radio. A warning. An alert. Vance had someone inside the Pentagon after all. Shadow 1, we have a problem. Eve reloaded the Dragunov with hands that wanted to shake. One of the Viper operators has turned. He's warning Vance. Ironside's voice was grim. I see him. The perimeter is compromised. Vance is going to run. Eve swung her scope toward the main building. Vance was already moving the briefcase forgotten, heading for a vehicle parked behind the structure. Al-Rashid was with him along with 3 of his men. I have a shot on the vehicle. Take it. Eve adjusted her aim. The tire was a small target at this distance, partially obscured by the building's corner. She would need to time the shot perfectly, catch the vehicle just as it cleared cover. She waited, breathed, found the stillness between heartbeats. The vehicle lurched into motion, accelerating toward the eastern road. Eve fired. The front tire exploded, sending the vehicle into a wild spin. It careened off the road and slammed into a rocky outcropping, its engine dying with a metallic screech. Vehicle disabled. Vance is on foot. I'm moving to intercept. Ironside's voice was tight. Stay on overwatch. Cover the remaining Viper operators. Eve turned her attention back to the airstrip. The firefight was winding down. 3 of the 4 remaining DevGru operators had taken cover behind a concrete barrier and were methodically eliminating the last pockets of resistance. Preston had disappeared into the darkness, heading east. Calloway was there too. She spotted him near the north side of the perimeter, his weapon up, providing covering fire for the Viper team. He had chosen his side. The buyers were finished. Al-Rashid's men lay scattered across the airstrip, their weapons silent. Their ambitions ended. The smuggler himself had fled with Vance, disappearing into the desert toward the Iraqi border. Eve stood up from her position. There was no more need for concealment. The only thing that mattered now was catching Vance before he escaped. She slung the Dragunov over her shoulder and began to run. The terrain was brutal, rocky and uneven, broken by dry wadis and sudden drops that could break an ankle with a single wrong step. Eve ignored the danger, pushing her body harder than she had pushed it since the fall, feeling the old injuries protest with every stride. She found Ironside about 200 meters from her sniper position. He was crouched behind a boulder, scanning the darkness with his pistol raised. His weathered face was grim but focused. Preston went east, he said as she approached, probably heading for the border. We let him go for now. Vance is the priority. They moved together through the rocky terrain, following the tracks of Vance's disabled vehicle. The trail was easy enough to read in the moonlight. Footprints, disturbed stones, the occasional dark stain that might have been blood or oil. They had covered maybe 50 meters when the shot rang out. Eve dove for cover, instinctively rolling behind a boulder as chips of stone exploded near her head. Ironside was beside her a second later, his back pressed against the rock, his pistol up and ready. Preston! Ironside's voice was tight. He circled back. Another shot cracked through the darkness, closer this time. Eve could hear movement somewhere to their left, the scrape of boots on stone as Preston maneuvered for a better angle. You go after Vance, Ironside said. I'll handle Preston. Marcus, don't argue. His cold eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw something there that might have been affection. Vance is getting away. Every second we waste here is a second he uses to disappear. I'm not leaving you. You're not leaving me. You're completing the mission. Ironside checked his pistol, then looked at her one last time. Your father would tell you the same thing. The mission comes first, always. Before Eve could respond, Ironside was moving. He broke from cover, running in a low crouch toward Preston's position, drawing fire away from her. Eve wanted to follow him. Every instinct screamed at her to stay, to help, to fight beside the man who had saved her life and trained her and believed in her when no one else did. But he was right. The mission came first. She turned and ran east toward the Iraqi border, toward Roland Vance. Behind her, she heard the sharp crack of pistol fire. Once, twice, 3 times. Then silence. Eve kept running. She found Vance 500 meters from the border, at the edge of a dry wadi that cut through the desert like a scar. He was alone. Al-Rashid had abandoned him somewhere in the darkness, fleeing to save his own skin. The commander stood at the edge of the ravine, his chest heaving, his uniform torn and dirty. He looked nothing like the confident, controlled officer she had met 6 weeks ago. He looked old, tired, beaten. He turned as Eve approached, and she saw that he was holding a pistol. "That's far enough." His voice was ragged but still commanding. The voice of a man who had spent 30 years giving orders. Eve stopped, her rifle raised, despite the trembling in her arms. "It's over, Vance. Your men are dead or captured. Your buyer is gone. The transaction has been documented and transmitted to Washington." Vance laughed. It was a hollow sound, empty of humor. "Over nothing is over." He waved the pistol in a vague arc. "Do you have any idea how many people I have in Washington? How many senators, generals, intelligence officials who have benefited from my work over the years? This will be classified, buried, just like everything else." "Not this time." Eve took a step forward. "Admiral Whitmore has the evidence, everything my father collected, everything we recorded tonight. It's already being distributed to every major news outlet in the country." Vance's expression flickered. "You're bluffing. CNN, Fox News, the New York Times, the Washington Post." Eve listed the names with grim satisfaction. "By morning, the whole world will know what you did, who you sold, how many Americans died because of your greed." Greed. The word came out as a snarl. "You think this was about money?" Vance took a step toward her, his pistol shaking with barely contained rage. "I gave this country everything, 30 years of my life, my health, my family, and what did I get in return?" His voice cracked. "My wife died because the VA said her cancer treatment was too expensive. My son put a gun in his mouth because no one would help him deal with what he saw in Afghanistan. 3 tours and they threw him away like garbage." Eve felt something shift in her chest. Not sympathy, not forgiveness, but understanding. The terrible, tragic logic of a good man who had let his pain twist him into something unrecognizable. "I'm sorry for your loss." She kept her voice steady. "Truly, but 11 SEALs are dead because of you. My father is dead because of you, and tonight you tried to sell out 200 more. They were going to throw us all away eventually." Vance's laugh was bitter. "Send us to fight their wars, use us up, and then discard us when we're no longer useful. I just decided to get paid for it. That's not a reason, that's an excuse." Vance stared at her for a long moment. The pistol in his hand trembled. His finger was on the trigger. "Your father said something like that to me once, right before I killed him." His voice dropped to a whisper. "He said a SEAL's honor isn't something the government gives us. It's something we carry inside ourselves, something no one can take away no matter how badly they treat us." He was right. Maybe. Vance raised the pistol, and for a heartbeat, Eve thought he was going to shoot her. Maybe he was. Instead, he turned the weapon around, pressing the barrel against his own temple. "I won't give them the satisfaction of a trial, of parading me in front of cameras so politicians can pretend they care about the men they send to die." "Don't!" The word came out before Eve could stop it. "Don't do this." Vance smiled. It was a sad expression full of regret and resignation. "You're your father's daughter, Lieutenant. He would be proud. His finger tightened on the trigger. The shot came from behind Eve. She spun around to see Ironside emerging from the darkness, his pistol extended, smoke curling from the barrel. Blood stained his shoulder, and he moved with a pronounced limp. But his aim had been true. The bullet had struck Vance's pistol, knocking it from his grip and sending it spinning into the wadi below. Vance stared at his empty hand, uncomprehending. No. Ironside walked forward, his weapon trained on Vance's chest. Each step seemed to cost him, but his voice was steady. You don't get to choose how this ends. You don't get to die a soldier's death and have people wonder if maybe you were just misunderstood. He stopped a few feet away from Vance, swaying slightly but refusing to fall. You betrayed your brothers, you sold their lives for money, and you're going to spend the rest of your miserable existence in a cell knowing that everyone who ever respected you now knows exactly what you are. Vance's face crumpled. For the first time, Eve saw the man beneath the mask, not a monster, just a broken human being who had made terrible choices and lost himself along the way. Kill me. The words came out as a plea. Please, just kill me. No. Eve stepped forward, pulling a set of zip ties from her vest. You're going to face a court-martial. You're going to answer for every person who died because of you. And when they lock you away in Leavenworth, you're going to spend every single day remembering their faces. She secured his hands behind his back, then turned to Ironside. The old soldier had sunk to his knees, his pistol hanging loose in his grip. The blood stain on his shoulder had spread, and his face was pale beneath its weathered tan. Marcus! Eve rushed to his side, her hands finding the wound. The bullet had gone clean through, but there was too much blood. Far too much blood. Stay with me. The helicopter will be here soon. Ironside shook his head slowly. Preston got lucky. Nicked something important. He coughed and red flecked his lips. Doesn't matter, we got him. Don't talk like that. You're going to be fine. Eve. His voice was gentle now, all the hardness gone. I've been dying for 3 years, living on borrowed time, waiting for a chance to make things right. He reached up and touched her face with bloody fingers. This is how it was always going to end. No. Tears burned in her eyes. No, you can't. Listen to me. His grip tightened, his cold eyes finding hers one last time. Your father gave his life trying to expose Vance. I gave 3 years hunting him. Tonight we finished it. Together. He coughed again, worse this time. His hand fell away from her face. Tell them, he whispered. Tell them SEALs don't die. We just change the watch. His eyes closed, his breathing slowed, and Colonel Marcus Brennan, call sign Ironside, 35 years of service to his country, was gone. Eve knelt beside him for a long moment, her hand pressed against his chest, feeling the absence where his heartbeat should have been. The tears came freely now, cutting tracks through the dust and blood on her face. Behind her, Vance made a small sound, perhaps grief, perhaps relief, perhaps simply the realization that his last chance for escape had died with the man on the ground. Eve didn't care. She stayed with Ironside until the helicopters arrived. Stayed with him as the medics rushed past to secure Vance. Stayed with him as the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky. Only when they lifted his body onto a stretcher did she finally let go. She had made a promise, and she would keep it. 6 weeks later, Eve stood in Arlington National Cemetery. The summer sun beat down on rows of white headstones, each one marking the final resting place of someone who had given their life in service to their country. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass and flowers mixed with the faint tang of the Potomac River in the distance. 2 new graves had been added to the silent ranks. The first belonged to Marcus Brennan, Colonel United States Army, Delta Force. The headstone was simple, unadorned, exactly as he would have wanted. The inscription read, "He changed the watch." Eve had chosen those words herself. It seemed fitting. The second grave was older, 5 years older, but the headstone had been updated, the inscription changed to reflect the truth that had finally come to light. Master Chief Thomas Hartley, United States Navy, SEAL Team 3, killed in action while defending his country against enemies, both foreign and domestic. The official story had been rewritten, the helicopter crash erased from the records. In its place, the truth, a hero who had uncovered treason at the highest levels of military command and paid for that knowledge with his life. Eve stood between the 2 graves, her dress blues immaculate, her chest bearing a silver star she hadn't asked for and didn't want. Admiral Whitmore stood beside her. Behind them, a crowd of mourners filled the cemetery paths. SEALs from every team, Delta operators, Rangers, men and women who had served with her father and Ironside come to pay their final respects. Calloway was there too, standing at attention near the back. He had been cleared of any involvement in Vance's conspiracy and promoted to Chief Petty Officer. A small reward for his courage. The ceremony was brief. Military honors, a rifle salute. Taps played by a lone bugler, the notes hanging in the summer air like a prayer. When it was over, Admiral Whitmore placed a hand on Eve's shoulder. "Your father would be proud of you," he said quietly. "They both would." Eve nodded, not trusting her voice. Whitmore studied her for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. "What are you going to do now, Lieutenant?" "You've earned some time off. God knows you've earned it." Eve looked down at the 2 headstones, at the names carved in white marble, at the legacy they represented. "DevGru is accepting applications," she said finally. "I thought I might put my name in." Whitmore's eyebrows rose. "That's a hard road, harder than anything you've faced so far." "I know." Eve turned to face him. "But someone once told me that a SEAL's honor isn't something the government gives us. It's something we carry inside ourselves, something no one can take away." She looked back at her father's grave. "I want to carry that honor. I want to be worthy of it." Whitmore was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "I'll make some calls. There's a selection course starting in 3 months. He extended his hand. "Good luck, Lieutenant." Eve shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, sir." The Admiral walked away, leaving Eve alone with the dead. She stood there for a long time, watching the shadows lengthen across the white headstones. Remembering, grieving, and slowly, gradually finding peace. Finally, when the sun began to set and the cemetery grew quiet, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object, her father's K-bar knife. The one Ironside had kept for 3 years. The one that had been waiting for her in the cave when she woke from her fall. The blade was worn but still sharp. The handle was wrapped in leather that had been smoothed by decades of use. And on the crossguard, barely visible after years of handling, were 3 words. "Seals don't die." Eve knelt between the 2 graves and pressed the knife into the soft earth at the base of her father's headstone. "I found the truth," she whispered. "I finished what you started, and I promise you I will never stop fighting for the things you believed in." She stayed there for a moment longer, her hand resting on the cool marble. Then she rose and walked away. The sun had set by the time she reached her car parked at the edge of the cemetery. Calloway was waiting for her, leaning against the hood with his arms crossed. "You okay?" he asked. Eve considered the question. Her body still ached from wounds that hadn't fully healed. Her heart still grieved for the men she had lost, She carried scars, visible and invisible, that would be with her for the rest of her life. But for the first time in 5 years, the weight on her shoulders felt lighter. "I will be," she said finally. "I will be." Calloway nodded and pushed off from the car. "Buy you a drink, I know a place nearby. Quiet, good bourbon." Eve almost smiled. "Rain check. There's something I need to do first." She reached into her jacket and pulled out a sealed envelope. It had been delivered to her quarters that morning, forwarded from the family home in San Diego. Her mother had found it while cleaning out the attic. A letter from her father tucked away in a safe deposit box with instructions to deliver it to Eve if anything ever happened to him. She had been carrying it all day, waiting for the right moment. "What's that?" Calloway asked. "A message from my father." Eve turned the envelope over in her hands. "He wrote it 5 years ago, before Vance killed him." Calloway's expression softened. "You want me to give you some space?" "No." Eve surprised herself with the answer. "No, I think I'd like someone here when I read it." They sat together on the hood of her car, watching the stars emerge one by one as the sky darkened. Eve opened the envelope with trembling fingers and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. Her father's handwriting, bold and confident, just like he had been. She read the words aloud, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "My dearest Eve, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for leaving you, for not being there to watch you grow into the woman I always knew you could become. By now, you probably know the truth about how I died. You probably know about Vance, about the betrayal, about everything I tried to stop. I'm sorry I couldn't finish what I started. I'm sorry I had to leave that burden for you. But I'm not sorry I fought. I'm not sorry I stood up for what was right, even when it cost me everything. That's what it means to be a SEAL. Not the training, not the missions, not the medals. It's the willingness to sacrifice everything for something bigger than yourself. You have that quality, Eve. I saw it in you from the day you were born. That fire, that determination, that refusal to quit no matter how hard things get. I know I wasn't always the father you deserved. I was gone too much, said too little, kept too many secrets. But everything I did, every choice I made, was because I wanted to protect you, to keep you safe from the darkness I spent my life fighting. I see now that I was wrong. You don't need protection. You never did. You're stronger than I ever was, braver, more determined. Whatever path you choose, whatever battles you fight, remember this: SEALs don't die. We just become ghosts watching over the people we love, guiding them through the darkness. I'll be watching over you, Eve, always. Be brave, be strong, be worthy of the uniform you wear, and never ever give up. All my love forever and always, Dad. Eve folded the letter carefully and pressed it against her heart. The tears came freely now, but they were not tears of grief. They were tears of gratitude. Calloway said nothing. He just sat beside her in the darkness, a silent presence offering comfort without words. Above them, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, indifferent to the struggles of the people below. But Eve didn't feel small beneath their light. She felt connected to her father, to Ironside, to every man and woman who had ever worn the uniform and stood ready to defend the things that mattered. SEALs don't die. They just become legends. Eve wiped her eyes and looked up at the sky. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered, "for everything." A warm breeze stirred the air around her, carrying with it the faint scent of salt and sea, and somewhere in the darkness, watching over her as he had promised, Thomas. Hartley smiled. Eve got to her feet, tucking the letter safely into her pocket next to the photograph she had carried for 5 years. "Ready?" Calloway asked. Eve nodded. Ready. She got in her car, started the engine, and drove toward the lights of Washington in the distance, toward whatever came next, toward a future she would build with her own hands on the foundation her father and Ironside had laid. Behind her, the cemetery grew dark and quiet, but the graves were not empty. The men buried there lived on, in the stories that would be told, in the legacy they had left behind, in the woman driving into the night carrying their memory like a flame that would never go out. Seals don't die. They change the watch. And somewhere in the darkness, two ghosts stood guard, waiting, watching, forever.